Good morning, good Yantiv, Shana Tova, Git Gebencht Yor. Okay, you choose one to say back. Boker Tov, whatever works. So first of all, some logistics. If you look at page 8 of your program, it is the outline of the service. So you can see where we are. We're in the middle section where it says Torah service, and we're at the Drasha or sermon section. There's going to be a slight change. We're doing the shofar service before the children's blessing, and then returning the Torah to the ark, then Musaf, and we're done. See, there we go. So first of all, how's everybody doing? Great? Inspired? Moved? It's so moving for me to see so many of our congregants engaged in the Torah service, so many people honored in the congregation, so many who are reading from the Torah, from the Haftorah, who are leading the service. If you notice this, in many synagogues, the cantor does all of that. In our synagogue, the cantor is supporting everybody who's doing that. It's so beautiful and so moving to see the range of participation reading from the Torah and really having literally hands on the Torah. So I add my thanks to all the congregants who I know have been working very hard preparing, and it's beautiful. These are ancient words written in an ancient language, read from these ancient scrolls of our tradition by those of us who are bizarrely modern, very quirky, and able to reach across thousands of years to these texts. So you might have noticed in this morning's text and in tomorrow morning's text, the theme of the Torah readings and the Haftorah readings are all about children. The theme is very clear. You'll notice, you might have seen in the Machzor, the Reform movement changes this morning's Torah reading to the story of the creation of the world, which is included in our Machzor, but we at CBSC do some things traditionally, and that is these two readings for today and tomorrow are both about the birth of unlikely children, the more unlikely survival of those children, the threats that their parents expose their children to, and the fact that we are the descendants of those children and those parents and those families which embrace jealousy and hatred and greed and fear and anxiety and terror as part of their families. Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. Rosh Hashanah is considered the birthday of the world. What a crazy concept. When we say it's a new year, we're not only saying it's a new year in the cycle of our year, we're saying we're celebrating the beginning of the world itself. 5,000, what's the number again? Hold on, just a second. 5,779 years ago, according to our tradition, the world was born. By the way, so it shouldn't freak you out, even the ancient rabbis understood those numbers were metaphors, and that we could not possibly know and count in the way that God counts. After all, what is a year to God? It can't possibly be the same thing as a year to us. So don't worry, we don't have any conflict between science and religion in Judaism. Think poetry, think metaphor. Don't get so anxious about literal. Part of the power of great religion is to free us a little bit from the literal, so that we could see things at 35,000 feet or from a distance where things are not so clear, but ironically, with that distance, we get greater clarity. You know, it's the old see the forest for the trees thing, or see the trees for the forest. And so that's what these days of awe are all about, at their essence. How to help us remove ourselves enough from the day-to-day craziness our lives are surrounded with, occupied with, engaged in. How do we disengage enough to be able to separate deep truth from the garbage. A lot of that garbage is necessary. We have to make a living, we have to pay the rent, we have to shop, we have to eat, we have to take care of children. But Rosh Hashanah is about trying to get the bigger question in the forefront rather than in the background. These days of awe are about the biggest questions. Who am I? What is my life worth? What is the purpose of my life? What is the purpose of the world? Why am I alive in this very moment? What am I meant to do? Who am I meant to be? And what have been the obstacles in my life that have prevented those things from happening? How do I look at the biggest possible picture and be able to frame the world in which we see it now as part of a much bigger story than only our narrow, small picture? Today is the birthday of the world. Shabbat, we know, is the 7th day of creation. So we're 6 days of creation, and the 7th day we rest. So creation, we're told, took 6 days. Again, people, think metaphor, think poetry. Don't worry about the number, but really think there's a process by which the world was created, and then there was a period of rest. That is hard-baked into our identity. If you think about the cycle of time, a day is an obvious natural cycle. A month is a natural cycle. But a week is not natural at all. It has no relationship to the sun and the moon in the way that a day or a month does. A week is the gift of the Jewish people to the world. This time, this concept that there are 6 days in which the world was created and then 1 day in which we rest, that is a gift of the Jewish sacred text to the world. It didn't exist before, and it is our gift. Today is the birthday of the world. We're told in our texts that between the 6 days and the 7th day of rest is a period of twilight called Bein Hashmashot in Hebrew. And it's a very important concept that as the sun was setting on the 6th day and the moment of creativity was slowing down and the moments of rest were increasing, in that twilight time, God created some special things. The things created between the clarity of the 6 days of creation and the clarity of the day of rest, this in-between time, are considered kind of magical or miraculous. It's as if God created things during this in-between time to place in the world that we as human beings would find them when they were really most needed. It's as if God was placing, what were those things in the Cracker Jacks? What were the little things in Cracker Jacks? The little prizes in Cracker Jacks. What were the little things that we would discover things in a life full of Cracker Jacks? All of a sudden, the things that God created, Bein Hashmashot, would appear to us if we were looking for them. So hold that for a second as we think about what they might have been. These things created that are there in our universe for us to find when they are most needed, but not always most obvious. So back to the stories of the reading of today and tomorrow. And you've heard me say, if you've heard me speak about these readings before, that I would bet most of us, if we were to pick the sacred readings that we would read on one of the most holy days of our year to start out the year, we would not pick texts in which our ancestors look so bad. There is a very grim and bleak picture set of the ancestors of our people. Sarah treats Hagar despicably. Abraham listens to Sarah and throws Hagar with his own child out into the wilderness to die. And then tomorrow, Abraham doesn't tell Sarah at all that he hears some voices that tells him to kill his own son, takes his son up to the mountain, and is willing to kill him for some voice he hears in his head. These are not stories, if we look at them with a certain perspective, that necessarily show our ancestors to be God-like, but they show them for sure to be human. And in that way, I believe they're there so that we can deeply relate to them, to the jealousy and the anxiety and the fear that our ancestors felt, that the children in their lives created this amount of tension, is a powerful story. So in today's story, different things happen. Abraham sends his own child out into the wilderness with a little food and water, thinking that they're to die. And tomorrow he takes his son on top of Mount Moriah and is prepared to kill him. So on this day where we celebrate the birthday of the world, Abraham, one of our ancestors, is to prepare to kill 2 of his children. This is the story we read. This is the story of Bein Hashmashot, of in-betweenness, of real pain and difficulty and ugliness. But ultimately, it's a story of spectacular miracles placed there at the right time for us to find when we need them. But first, as we see if we look in the text of both of the stories, Abraham in tomorrow's story and Hagar in today's story has to hit rock bottom and be prepared to say, I can't do it alone. Hagar in today's story, in this spectacular scene, which, by the way, is powerful for both Jews and Muslims, and the story is told differently in the Muslim sacred texts. And Hagar's experience is codified in the Muslim world by being part of the story of what happens when Muslims go on Hajj, which is similar, of course, to the word Chag, because it's from the same root. When a Muslim goes on Hajj or Chag, they experience the going back and forth between the 2 mountains that Hagar is told to go back and forth as she panics about the possible death of her child. Our peoples, these Muslim and Jewish peoples, are so inextricably woven together in these 2 stories. And in both of them, today's miracle is that Hagar looks up at a certain moment, and then God, we're told, places a well. And the well, of course, in the middle of a desert, as anyone who was on the trip this summer could attest, if you're in the desert, finding a little bit of water is a spectacular miracle. And if you don't think it's there, it's easy to completely give up. And Hagar's genius and her brilliance is that as weak as she was as a human being, that she cried over the potential death of her child, she was able, even in the midst of that total sense of despair, she looked up, and what did she see? Something that was created Bein Hashmashot. One of the things we're told that was created in this time between the 6 days of creation and the 7th day are the wells that were in the desert. So Hagar looks up, but notice the text does not say God showed them to her before she looked up. She had to take action first by looking up, which indicates, if it isn't totally clear, I will say this over and over and over again, she had to power through that despair that she was about to see her own child die and not give in to the despair of the moment enough to be able to find a solution. The reason we tell the story of Hagar is because she didn't give up. Had she given up, her child would have died, the story would have been over, and we would not be reading about it today. But the reason we read about Hagar is not because she managed to avoid perhaps the most horrifying situation a human could be in, to see a child crying out for help and no adults around to help. She didn't give up. She insisted on finding a solution. She didn't let her personal despair block her from finding a solution. We are in a world where there are many children crying out to us. And many of us have sunk into deep despair about the possibilities that we can actually help. This story tells us in this new year, Hagar, who is the mother, if you will, of Islam, tells us that we are not allowed to give up until we save the children. It's not an option. But once we don't allow the despair to destroy us, we are told we will find a solution. This summer, only a few weeks ago, as everybody heard last night, I was privileged and honored to travel with the first Families with Children trip to Israel and to study issues of Palestinians and Israelis, to learn how to make za'atar, to understand the occupation of the West Bank, to ride camels, and to do jeep tour of Golan Heights, among many, many other things. When we checked into our kibbutz guest house in Jerusalem, the manager of the guest house is a Palestinian who lives in a small village, as many of the guest house staff live in a small Palestinian village not far from the kibbutz where we were staying. And when he found out that I was from New York, he said to me, not knowing anything about the synagogue I'm from or where or anything about New York, he's never been to the United States. This man said to me, a Palestinian who lives in a small village that was in the West Bank, that's now annexed to Jerusalem, that's the manager of this kibbutz hotel, said to me, have you ever heard that there are some Jews in New York who go to a mosque every Friday and stand with signs that say, Jewish New Yorkers support our Muslim neighbors? I said, well, in fact, we are that synagogue. Yoav Davis just told me last night that there are two Muslims who have been interviewed as part of a film, that in the interview they said one of the things that gives them strength is that there are these Jews in New York who every Friday show up at this mosque. A story about this activity. Hagar, Ishmael, Abraham, Isaac, these stories that we read on Rosh Hashanah are deeply, deeply interwoven. They form the foundation of our histories together. House of Peace, which is our effort to create a narrative which breaks the narrative of hate, which so many propagate about Muslims and Jews, is CBST's effort to make sure that we are part of creating a well in the middle of the desert, that if we look up, we will see a solution, even if it's not visible at first. We've been there every single Friday for the Juma prayers, the major communal prayer for the Muslim community. And here's what I'm going to say as a challenge to everyone here. In this coming year, try to find a way to come on one Friday. Come once. Come for a few minutes, come for half an hour, take a long lunch break from work, take the day off, figure out a day in this coming year to be part of the presence of Jews standing in front of the mosque at NYU saying, we Jews stand with our Muslim neighbors. A couple of stories I share with you. The third time we had done it, a young woman came up to me. After the first time we did it, we brought 100 red roses that we gave out to all the Muslims coming up, which was the Friday after the election. And the third time we had done it, a young woman came up to me who was a law student at Yale Law School, who comes down every Friday to go to this particular mosque for prayer. And she said to me, she wanted me to know that she took that flower, that rose, from that first day, and she has it drying in her apartment in New Haven, so that she remembers that there are people in the world who are breaking the narratives of hate that she's been taught as well. And even when she can't come down, she looks at that rose to remind her. We brought another 180 roses after the Muslim ban was passed by the Supreme Court of the United States, effectively based on religion, banning Muslims from several Muslim-majority countries from even being able to come into this country. That Friday, we went down in big numbers and with 180 roses. This time, we dethorned them. I didn't know that was a thing, but I've learned. And we handed out 180 roses. One of the Muslim worshipers whom we've gotten to know over these years, really it's now been a year and a half, came with sunflowers to give to us. And we exchanged the sunflower and the rose, and then he sent a photograph of it to Harold Levine, who is the chair of our House of Peace effort, which showed us that his wife, when he got home, took the sunflower and the rose and placed them together on the mantelpiece of their home where they have their most precious family photographs, so that the sunflower and the rose would be there together, that they see all the time. Now, these are not big actions, but they are actions that change the course of history. Those of you who have been regulars know that you've gotten to know so many of the regulars there. And a year and a half ago, for Gay Pride, I invited the imam of the mosque to come to CBST to give the Drasha for Gay Pride. Now let's talk about the number of narratives of hate we exploded by doing that, and the number of narratives of ignorance he exploded by coming and speaking. And he said in his sermon that night to us, many might wonder what a straight Muslim religious leader is doing at the gay synagogue for Gay Pride. And he said to us, many people have written us letters to say that they stand with us with the hatred of this administration and this Supreme Court targeting the Muslim community. But the people who show up are the LGBT Jews of New York. And he said, as you are with us, we are with you. Hagar was able to look up and to create a reality, so to speak. God then brought her this water, this well which had been prepared, Bein Hashmashot, to be there. This is what I believe miracles are. We have to create the conditions in which they can happen. It doesn't mean they always do, by the way. We all know that. But Hagar's ability to never give in to despair itself makes it possible that if you look at the long view, if you look at the very long view, we can be part of the transformation of the world for the better. It doesn't mean, by the way, we will see all the results in our own lifetime. We know the famous story that I told, by the way, in 1998. Some of you might have been here. Ruth Berman reminded me of the Drasha I gave in 1998, telling this story to say to us as a community, we had to create a Hebrew school because we as a community needed to be able to be a place in which children of our families and others could raise their children to be Jews. I gave that Drasha in 1998, and last night Shoshana Hirschman, 14 years old, born and raised in this congregation with her loving and spectacular family, could give the Drasha she gave last night. The story is the famous one, of course, of the carob tree planter in the Talmud, who's laughed at by somebody who says, why are you planting a carob tree? It takes so long for the fruit to bear. It could be 40, 50, 60, 70 years before there's really serious fruit. And he said, just as somebody planted a tree 70 years ago from which I can eat now, I need to plant a tree so that 70 years from now, somebody who is not yet even born will be able to eat. We have to have the long view of the moment in history we are in. We who are adults have to be building a foundation for a future, even if we don't have immediate results this year or next year or the year after. We have to be thinking about how those children, the Shoshanas of the world who will grow up, will be able to look back and say, they remembered that we behaved like Hagar. We did not give up despite the despair that we could experience in our world. We didn't moan and cry about how bad things were all the time without doing something. None of us can do everything, but every single one of us can do something. Our job is not to transform the world to be the place that we want it to be alone. Our job is to remember what Hagar understood, that her job was to make sure her child survived. She could not risk complete despair. We cannot risk complete despair, which paralyzes us. As Ruth Messenger says over and over again, and I love to quote, despair is not a strategy. It is not a strategy. And our job, each one of us, is to make sure in this year we do what we can to imitate Hagar, to not give in to the point where we give up. That can be hard for some of us. Not to mention, many of us here are New Yorkers. Many of us are gay. Many of us are Jewish. All of those personalities are pessimistic personalities. Believe me, I recognize that in myself. And that's why Rosh Hashanah is here. We have to sometimes push ourselves out of what might be natural stasis in order to be the human beings that God knows we can be. It is the birthday of the world. It is new beginnings always. It is the belief that we can return to the essence of who we are. Judaism does not believe in original sin. We believe each of us is born pure. And in the course of our lifetime, we pile on a lot of muck. These 10 days of awe are about our returning to the purity of who we are, to remembering the goodness, the perfection of who we are, and letting that emerge. It's about removing as much gunk as we can, which is not easy to do, and we will fail. But every time we try, we're a little bit closer than when we didn't. So Hagar is a model for us, that she looked up and saw this miraculous well. But the miracle wasn't just that the well was there. The miracle was that she didn't give in to the despair and was able to find the solution that she hadn't seen before. The other profound miracle that we read about today is the peace treaty signed between Avimelech and Avraham. That is often ignored and neglected in Divrei Torah and Drashot on the High Holy Days because the theme of the children is so powerful. So why is there a description of a peace treaty between enemies on Rosh Hashanah when we read about children and birth and parents and protecting the future? Again, I don't think that's there as a coincidence. We suffer from a lack of imagination every time we say peace is not possible. Transformation is not possible. It can't happen that Northern Ireland and the South could ever come to an agreement of peace. How long did the troubles in Ireland continue? In 1943, had you spoken to a French person and said, imagine there will be an open border with Germany and you won't even have to show a passport to travel back and forth, there would not have been an imagination which would have made that possible. If you had said to the Jews, to those gay Jews who met in a minyan on February 9th, 1973, in 40-something years, Eric will do the math for me, in 40-something years, There will be 1,500 Jews celebrating Rosh Hashanah together. A 14-year-old child of the congregation will give a talk on Rosh Hashanah. You will have a Haredi rabbi on your clergy team. You will have straight rabbis on your clergy team. You will have rabbis from the conservative movement, from the reform movement, from the Reconstructionist movement, Haredi, and all gender identities and sexual orientations. There is not a single person who was at the original service for CBST who could have possibly had the imagination to see who we are today. We can't possibly have the imagination of what could be in 40-something years from now. That is, I believe we can't have that imagination on our own. And that is what faith and God and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva are here to teach us. Have an imagination. Don't believe only what you've been told. Imagine what is possible. Im tirtzu ein zo agada. It is the theme of our people. If you will it, if you can dream it, it's no dream. But you must not give up. In tomorrow's story, the similar thing happens, but it's not despair that threatens Abraham, it's arrogance. Abraham, after all, you remember, has heard God's voice in his ear. If somebody came up to us and said, we've heard God's voice, and God's voice told me I should kill some of the congregants at CBST, we would say, she needs some help. Abraham, this language is about telling us about arrogance. Abraham thought he knew absolute right from wrong. And his absolute right meant he had to sacrifice his child in order to satisfy his religion. And just as he's about to kill the child, and if you don't know the story, come back tomorrow, we'll go over it in detail then. Just as he's about to kill his own child, he looks up, the same thing that Hagar does, and he sees a ram. Guess what else was created, Bein Hashmashot, in this period between the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest? The ram's horn. God had it there, waiting for it to be needed. And at that moment, and yes, the same thing happens, Abraham looks up. His genius, his brilliance, the reason we worship him as an ancestor is not because he was perfect, because he was really, really not perfect. But he demonstrates to us the ability that in the midst of thinking he knew exactly what was right, a little thing came into his head and said, you know what? Let me pause. Let me look up and see if there's another possible way that this story can end. Let me see, is there anything that can happen besides my killing my own child that will satisfy God? He looks up and he sees the ram. And instead of his child, he sacrifices the ram. And on Rosh Hashanah, the shofar we sound is the sound of the ram's horn. So our ability to not give in to despair and our ability to be a little bit humble about what is right and wrong all the time will keep us open, I believe, to God's presence in our lives. And in the world in which we live right now, we need God's presence. Whatever you imagine God to be, the power that makes for salvation, the power in the universe that breathed the soul into your body, the power of the natural world which makes the gardens grow and the leaves come out in the springtime, the power that creates the oceans and the sun and the moon, the power that is greater than us as human beings. That power is on our side to do tshuva and to become the best human beings we can be. These days of awe are about giving us that perspective, removing us a little bit from the cell phones and the devices and from Rachel Maddow a little bit, and trying to get us just briefly, to see the biggest picture, to know that if we are alive at this moment, it is because our souls have something unique to offer. Every single one of us. If you are alive in this moment, you've had ancestors who went through hell to be here. If you are alive at this moment, you have gone on a journey to be able to sit in this room today that had somebody told you as a teenager you could have been out and living a life like this, you couldn't have had the imagination then. If you are alive today, it is because you have been given the obligation to not despair and to not be arrogant, but with the strength of God's presence in your life. Again, whatever you imagine God to be, a power that's bigger than you, that's calling on you, that's demanding of you, do something. You cannot do everything, but everyone can do something. There are miracles in the world. Every flower in the sidewalk, every bird in the sky, every relationship in the world. It's a matter of whether we open our eyes. And over that, we each have control. So I pray for all of us in this year in which we will not know who will live and who will die. We will not know what evil will emerge and what horrors will be visited upon this world, both naturally created and those not so natural but human created. We will not know, but we will have control over how we respond and whether we will be part of building a foundation for those who will come after us, so that history will look back on all of us sitting in this room to know that we did what we could to make sure that there is a future for children, a future for LGBTQ, a future for Muslims, a future for women, a future in which a world will exist exactly as our greatest and most powerful imaginations can imagine. You know, when Central Park was created, and every rock and every tree in Central Park is created by the landscape architects who created that park. There isn't a natural thing in that park. When the park was opened, the newspaper articles reported that it was awfully ugly and straggly. There were barely any trees. There was barely any green. And the landscape designers, so famous to all of us New Yorkers, responded, "This park is not created for this generation. This park and the trees and the landscape will be there for a generation long after I die. That's when you will see what my vision for Central Park will be." And that's exactly what we have to be doing all the time. We can't judge our success by what it looks like in any given day. We have to model for people around us. Because guess what? We don't know which one among us will be the one who makes the difference. We don't know which child among us, as Shoshana described last night, hearing adults say something will inspire children in ways we can't imagine. We don't know what we will do, but we can do this. Every day, we can act in ways that proves to somebody else that goodness exists in the world. We can be the reason people believe in the goodness of humanity. We can be the reason every single day. So as we shift now into the shofar service, when we, for the first time in this 57-79 celebration of prayer and study and fellowship and seeing each other, we're going to listen for that shofar sound. And that shofar, which was created bein hashmashot, in the in-between time, is there to be the miracle we're all waiting for. But we're told we have to listen to be able to hear it. And that's what my charge is to all of us this morning. As we listen to this first sounding of the shofar, what will we do? Who will we be? How will we embrace Hagar and Avraham this year to be the voices that do not give in to despair or arrogance, and to be the presence of goodness and love in this world? A sweet and a healthy new year, and now we prepare for the shofar sounding.